Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you, Dr. César Hernández from SENER, the Deputy Secretary of Electricity, and Adrian this morning and joining us online for our first webinar of 2015. So we're officially kicking off the 2015 Energy Webinar Series here at the Institute of the Americas. And we wanted to focus on renewable energy in Mexico because, as Alexis mentioned, and you'll see at the bottom of the slide here, at the end of last year, Alexis led a research project that ended up producing a report called Redefining Renewable Energy in Mexico. So we wanted to use that report and pivot from that to have a discussion of where renewables and what the future of renewables are for Mexico, especially in the new framework. And I just want to mention a couple of pieces from that report. But before I do that, I also want to throw out a couple of headlines because obviously we're having this webinar at the same time that the oil price and the low oil price issue continues to be one that's dominating energy headlines around the world. And I've seen a couple of stories or articles recently, the headlines of which I think are interesting to consider at the outset of our webinar. And one, just a couple of days ago, the headline was, "Cheap Oil, the Antithesis of Clean Energy?" question mark. So I think that's one thing we want to try and consider. And the second article that was a few weeks ago, it came out from the IDB, and it said, "Geothermal energy and fuel prices. Time to seize the moment?" question mark. So I think we're going into this new year with this low oil price question causing lots of issues, obviously, for the upstream and for oil and gas companies. But I think it's also, it will be useful to understand what it means for renewables. And just in terms of the report we did last year, Mexico obviously has taken great steps forward, even before the energy reform. And over 5 years ago, Mexico set a target of electric generation from non-fossil fuel sources of 35% by the year 2024. Now, that target is obviously a very laudable target, but we also, in our report, realized that right now, renewables, and if we include hydropower even, renewables only account for about 14% of Mexico's total generation, which obviously, as we talk in 2015, is a long way from the 35% by 2024. And so I think the fact is, how much more renewables need to come online to hit that target, but how will those come online? What are the projects, and what are the policies that are now being put in place to unleash those renewable projects? And that's what we want to talk about today. So we're really pleased to have our conversation, our presentation start today with Deputy Secretary for Electricity at the Secretary of Energy, the Ministry of Energy in Mexico, César Hernández. And Dr. Hernández took this job as Deputy Secretary almost a year ago. He was appointed in February of 2014 as Undersecretary for Electricity. He's well known. He's literally written the book on electric reform in Mexico. He's a graduate of UNAM. And we greatly value his insights, and given the role of SENER in policy making, we look forward to him starting our conversation and laying out the elements of the implementation and what that means as we try to understand the future for renewables in Mexico. We'll have his presentation, we'll hold the questions, and then have Adrian Katzew's presentation. Adrian, since late last year, has been the CEO of Zuma Energía. Prior to that, worked actively in Mexico on renewables, specifically wind power, where he was the Vestas for Mexico, Director of Mexico and Central America. Again, Adrian has got a very unique perspective and lots to add to our conversation. So without any further ado, I will invite Dr. Hernández, Undersecretary Hernández, to begin the presentations, and we'll wait for the questions. And as Alexis mentioned, I will moderate that using the tools on our platform here. Mr. Undersecretary, thank you so much for your time this morning. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be in this webinar. Thank you for inviting me. If you allow me, I will just start the presentation and follow the path you suggested. The presentation is called "The Future for Renewable Energy in Mexico," and basically what I will do is give you the context, how the different instruments contemplated in the reform that I think will help us to create an attractive environment for new investment, especially in clean energy in Mexico. I think that the end result should be that different people interested in participating in the industry should be able to develop projects without barriers, delays, without extra costs. They should be able to get a good price for clean energy. They should be able to get safe, secure, stable, long-term contracts, and they should be able to recover investments. And the different institutions and different regulatory mechanisms that we are establishing, I think, will help us get to that objective that I have just described. So, starting with the context of the reform, if you go to the next slide, please. Basically, what we have to say is that Mexico has undertaken a major change in terms of its own regulatory history. We have come in a little bit over a year ago. We had a very closed regulatory system. It was closed at the constitutional level. It was closed at the at the legislation level, and it was also closed at the regulatory level, at the level of rules. And that closed system basically did not allow us to get all the advantages that we can from having the introduction of competition, of markets, of proven instruments that can be used to incorporate, for instance, clean energy. And so in this slide, basically, what we are highlighting are some of the objectives of the reform: reducing costs, electricity rates, reducing environmental impact, diversifying generation, assuring reliable services, guaranteeing universal access, and some of the actions that will be undertaken to achieve those objectives: modernizing the generation fleet, which is old, inefficient in a large degree, bringing more investment in transmission, improving the velocity at which different projects are interconnected to the national grid, optimizing dispatch, reducing investment risk, and reducing losses. And some of the tools, basically, one is the creation of a competitive market, the introduction of a principle of open access, making planning and dispatch independent from the operator, introducing a new mechanism of renewable portfolio standard through clean energy certificates, introducing new contracts so that despite the fact that CFE still has the monopoly of transmission and distribution, that monopoly is much more limited than in the past, because private parties will be able to develop the grid through contracts with either CFE or the government, and establishing a mechanism, a universal service fund, to introduce electricity to those parts of the country, mainly rural areas, that do not have access to electricity yet. Next slide, please. The next slide basically gives a snapshot of the new industry structure as we envision it. In this industry structure, the first thing you can see CFE, which is our national electricity company, basically operating in the new structure through subsidiaries, both in generation, in transmission and distribution, in retailing. A new figure that didn't exist before, the SENACE, which is an independent system operator created by the reform, which will be in charge of operating the spot market and operating auctions through which different companies will participate and will get stable long-term rates for its energy, for its capacity, for products such as clean energy certificates, if those projects are clean. The SENACE will optimize dispatch. In general, at the level of consumption, there will be basic service users, regulated users, and free users or qualified users, which is how our law calls them. And this is basically a structure which is very different from what was and still is, in general terms, the reality for the electricity power industry in Mexico. Next slide, please. This other slide makes even more patent the fact that some of the things have changed radically from what they were before. In the shadowed part, you can see the institutional roles developed pre-reform, and in the clear part of the slide, you can see how they are now. And the first difference that you can observe just by looking at this slide is basically that many of the institutional roles, the regulatory roles in the pre-reform structure were basically in charge of CFE, which presented a big conflict of interest and which was a big reason for competition and for efficient structures not to develop in the past. And in the clear area, you can see that many of the roles are basically in hands of the independent system operator, of the regulator, the Energy Regulatory Commission, the CRE, and in some of the policy roles and in jumpstarting the market, in charge of CENER. So either in the old time, basically the CRE, the Regulatory Commission, was limited to issuing permits and participating in a minor way in the definition of final rates for electricity. Whereas in the new institutional role, under the new electricity power law, basically they administer the clean energy certificates, they develop functions of market monitoring, they modify the market rules, and they develop the market rules, not the initial set which is developed by CENER, but all the permanent role of developing market rules once the market starts. They have ample powers to regulate tariffs for all the services of the electricity industry, and it's a more balanced, a much more a set of institutional roles which is much more familiar to any country that has an electricity market, and which is very different from what it was in the past. If we go to the next slide, please. Just one example, how the dispatch worked before the reform and how it will work with the reform. And basically, in the pre-reform stage, there was two parallel types of dispatch. One which was optimal, which was optimized in engineering and economic terms, which was in hand of SENACE as a unit of CFE, and a parallel system where no dispatch actually took place, but all the energy was basically injected into the system and transmitted to the end users. With the reform, this opportunity for optimization of electricity injected into the system and delivered to the end users is basically taken advantage of, with putting all the dispatch in charge of this new independent system operator, which is the SENACE, which has already been taken out of CFE, created as an independent entity, and is operating since the last 2 months of last year. So we go to the next slide, please. And we can see also how interconnection differs from what it was before and what it is now under the reform. In December, the SENACE, now as an independent entity, published the interconnection criteria, which basically simplifies significantly the interconnection process. What you can see in the image is basically how they deal with an application taken in isolation, an application by a generator which wants to connect to the grid. And there were 47 steps before, 9 steps after. There is also, in the new interconnection criteria, a different procedures through which different applications from different plants can be aggregated and considered in the planning process, so that many economies can be taken advantage of, and not all the transmission lines can be considered as a package and not necessarily as a standalone application. So in this matter, there is already regulation. It's under public consultation process now, and it will probably be published in the next 2 weeks. But this is a very important issue on which the reform has already produced some regulation and some results. That despite the fact that also SENACE, as an independent entity, this new ISO that we created, has already dealt in the 3 months that it's been functioning as an independent entity with as many applications for interconnection as were dealt before by CFE in a whole year. So not only with the old procedures is it moving much faster, but new streamlined procedures and more rational procedures are being put in place to deal with interconnection, which was a big barrier for renewables in the past and in general for private projects. If we go to the next slide, please. This slide highlights the clean energy potential in Mexico. And basically, if you consider clean energy in only its core, not taking into account big hydro or other resources, and you only take wind, geothermal, solar, mini hydro, you get to a 4% by the end of the year 2013. It's probably higher now. But when you compare that with the potential that Mexico has, both in solar resources, wind resources, geothermal resources, you actually can see that Mexico has been blessed by nature with a good set of natural resources and a good basis on which to develop and achieve those clean energy objectives and targets it has set for itself. So we go to the next slide, please. The specific mechanism introduced in the electricity power industry law, which was published last year, is a renewable portfolio standard type of mechanism, which is implemented to these clean energy certificates established in the law. The way this mechanism works is basically that the Ministry of Energy establishes every year the requirement, the specific requirements to use that will be applicable by either qualified users or by the basic service suppliers, and which will have to be complied with by them in a period starting 3 years after the requirement is set. And the objective of this mechanism is basically to give incentives to the development of new projects and give a new way of financing and bridging the gap in costs that clean energies may have still in comparison with some fossil fuel generation projects. The income from the certificate itself, the idea is that it allows generators to cover their costs and to be more competitive. This is a mechanism which is designed to be technology neutral, so that the project that generates the most impact in terms of the incorporation of clean megawatts into the system at the lowest cost will be the one that will be incorporated. And as technology evolves, some technologies will be more competitive than others, and in some parts, some technologies will have natural advantages, but we will not play favorites. It will be basically decided through the market. This mechanism is also thought of in terms of operating through auctions, which will give projects the ability to finance themselves and to have some certainty in the future. There will be long-term auctions which might range from 10 to 20-year contracts, and through which these certificates will be offered, will be acquired. There will be certainty in the price that will be paid for them, and this will allow new projects to be developed with certainty. If we go to the next slide, please. The energy reform package introduced also a new geothermal energy law. This law basically tried to deal with one of the main obstacles to development of geothermal energy in Mexico, which was basically the different authorities which were involved in the process of authorizations, which created a lack of legal certainty for the projects, and was seen by private investors and from several companies that were interested in developing this geothermal potential in Mexico as the main barrier for the development of their projects. The new geothermal energy law basically introduced figures such as permits for exploration and development, concessions for production of geothermal energy, with timelines and that were considered adequate for the development of these projects. The geothermal energy law provided also for CFE an opportunity to develop those fields in which it had already conducted some efforts of exploration and development, and to have a first go at choosing those fields. But apart from that, and CFE presented its application for the fields it wants to keep, the field is open for private investment, and there will be a lot of interest in the development of this type of energy. If we go to the next slide, please. The electricity industry, electricity power industry law also considered several elements that are aimed at supporting distributed generation, whether it's solar or it's wind. There have been in the past years, thanks to the support of the regulator, the Energy Regulatory Commission, an important development in that area in Mexico. The CRE has granted many notice of registry, which is the figure that is used to notify and to get a contract with CFE. So in order that people who install solar panels in their homes, they can take the advantage of selling the excess energy into the grid and getting a credit for the energy they got from CFE. The reform basically codifies that into law and gives also new powers to the Energy Regulatory Commission in order to improve training, financing for this type of developments. It is an area where, as I said before, a lot has been done through the regulator, through regulatory decisions, and the law basically codifies that and gives that right of final users, of end users, to take advantage of that regulation. If you go to the next slide, please. This basically this slide is done on the basis of the last POISE, the last program that was published for CFE, which was a very seriously documented program, and basically it quantifies the new generation capacity that will be needed in Mexico in the 2013-2028 period, and basically where Mexico will need to add 66 gigawatts of new capacity, and that will mean an investment of $90 billion US, and basically that provides a huge opportunity for new private companies as well as for CFE to grow and basically provide more energy for Mexico. When people were concerned in Mexico about whether the new electricity power industry law would introduce more competition and limit CFE in its potential and its ability to reap gains from the reform, we always answered saying, well, no, there is ample space of growth, both for public and for private companies. So it's basically the old existing inefficient capacity that will be driven out, and but there are ample ways of benefiting either for the old electric utility and for the new entrants. If you go to the next slide, please. This slide highlights one of the aspects of the reform that probably has not drawn too much attention yet, but which is one of the most promising, which is the fact that we are allowing, under the new electricity power industry law, CFE and the state to basically develop the grid with more modern ways. We have seen in several places in Asia, Europe, in Brazil, the development of transmission lines in modalities of public-private participations, which have been able to develop these lines at lower cost with much faster periods of introduction of the lines and at competitive costs. And so that is a new possibility under the law, and many private companies have shown interest, as well as CFE has shown interest in using that to develop the transmission lines. So that's a new modality that will be introduced from Mexico and that didn't exist in the past. If you go to the next slide, please. Very recently, there was an announcement by several private companies and also by CFE saying that in the next four years, investments in the order of $14 billion US will take place only in wind energy. So we were very encouraged by the fact that some of the developers considered that our new institutions including, and the regulation and the laws that have been published gave them enough legal certainty for them to commit that type of investment in Mexico in the next years. So we will see how that develops, but it is a show of the potential that the electricity power industry law and regulations that accompany it are showing, and it's also very important for us. If you go to the next slide, please. This slide highlights the fact that energy reform in Mexico and in electricity in particular is proceeding at a very fast pace. And it shows the sense of urgency that different authorities have shown in implementing what was published first as a constitutional amendment and then as a new law. And basically what it shows is that from the moment in which the laws were published, the secondary laws were published, it took Mexico less than a month to publish the decree that created the independent system operator, that SENACE, established the new Electricity Universal Service Fund, also in a month and a half. By the end of October, less than 3 months after the law was published, the bylaw of the electricity industry law was published, the clean energy guidelines were published, the temporary import rules were published by the CRE, by the Energy Regulatory Commission. In December, we published for public consultation the criteria for interconnection of generation. And this month, before the month ends, we are hoping to publish the electricity market rules, basis of the market, as the law calls them. I think that every one of these instruments is sending signals about how the reform will be implemented. And as you can see, we are hoping to have the electricity market, the spot market, and the market where the auctions for long-term contracts for basic service users will be conducted. It will be in place by the end of December of this year. There are several resolutions that have to be put in place. First, the business practice manuals pertaining to the market rules, the electricity market contract models, the program of development of the grid, which would have to be published by June this year, and the rates for transmission distribution, which will have to be published by the Energy Regulatory Commission in the second half of this year. But we are proceeding at a very fast pace with the implementation of the reform. If you go to the last slide, please. Or was it like, oh, this is another way of looking at the implementation plan. But basically, as you can see, most of the basic pieces will be put together by December this year. They are being done by SENACE, by the Independent System Operator, by the CRE, by the Energy Regulatory Commission, and by SENER. And until now, we have complied with every deadline that we have established for ourselves, and we hope to go on doing that in the near future. So I would also only end by saying that our objective, as I said in the beginning, is creating this attractive environment for new investment, especially for clean energy, that will allow people to develop projects without barriers, delays, extra costs, get a good price for their clean energy, get a safe, secure, stable, long-term contract, and recover their investment. And that's what we hope to achieve in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cesar. That was fantastic, not only in terms of the discussion of the renewable energy market, but also a very, very great update on the broader electric market and reforms. Thank you so much for that, and congratulations on the pace. Congratulations to you and everyone at SENER and the government, SENACE, and everywhere. Congrats on the pace of the implementation, and we look forward to staying in touch on that. We've got questions already. I mentioned at the beginning, but in case folks weren't online yet, we're going to hold the questions until we have Adrian Katzew's presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A session. So, Cesar, with your permission, I'll invite Adrian to take the microphone here. And Adrian Katzew is CEO of Zuma Energía, and he's going to give us a few of his thoughts as a market operator and developer of projects. Adrian.
Thank you very much. First of all, good morning to all. Thanks to the Institute of the Americas for the invitation. It is an honor to be here. It's an honor to be able to speak together with Undersecretary Hernández, who who has been a great leader of all this process. And I have to mention that in our experience within the Mexican Wind Energy Association, his team has always been very open to welcoming us, listen to us, and think jointly. And I want to express my gratitude to that. I will try to be really fast because I'm one of many who I'm sure want to ask questions from Undersecretary Hernandez. So I'll try to go through the slides relatively quickly. And then we'll see if there's any interest to go into the specific details. I'll be glad to answer questions. If we could go to the next slide, please. We'll skip this one as well. The next one. Excellent. So this is just a reminder of the drivers of why we're all having this conversation and why the topic of renewable energies has had such a significant growth over the past years. No? The first one, and maybe many of you picked this up in the news, but very recently, NASA just confirmed that we have reached the warmest year ever recorded in history. And that this confirms a significant upward trend in the rise of temperature, which you can see in the right-hand side. And when you ask me why do I do what I do it out of conviction. I believe that renewable energies are an imminent and crucial need for the future sustainability of our civilization for our children and our grandchildren to come. That's one message. But the other message that I think it's part of what Jeremy was alluding to is what happens in terms of competitiveness and economics, right? And Jeremy alluded to the current context of fossil fuels and their prices, and that is part of the context we're in right now. And the only thing I would like to remember, everybody, is we've been here before several times, right? It's not the first time that fossil fuels are cheap and then they become expensive again. So I think one of the things we would like to see, and a message we've been sharing across different forums, is about the robustness of long-term energy planning. Long-term energy planning has to include risk management as its core element. And from a risk management perspective, there is an element in terms of diversification of fuels, and there is an element as well of energy independence. And when it comes to these two variables, renewable energies are an extremely compelling solution, even taking aside the critical sustainability issue that I was highlighting before. So that is a complement in terms of the conversation we're having. One thing I wanted to do as well is just take this slide for a moment to emphasize what is the definition of clean energies. The definition of clean energies under the Mexican law includes also hydro and nuclear, which maybe to some of us could have a compelling argument in terms of the lack of CO2 emissions, but it also includes combined heat and power, or cogeneration, as some of you might refer to it. I'm glad to say that after several sessions in collaboration in between the private sector and the public sector, where we expressed our concern about how that was going to be managed, a reasonable proposal came through in terms of cogeneration only participating in the clean energies definition from the gap in between the most efficient thermal plant beyond in a proportional allocation. So just wanted to remember that the definition expands and includes some technologies that actually use fuels and emit CO2 and other emissions as well. Next slide, please. And the following one, please. I mean, these maps are known. Mexico holds a vast and significant resource on wind, solar. I think Undersecretary Hernandez also underlined geothermal. One of the things I wanted to share with you, which is actually on the next slide, we could go to the next slide, please. These are exercises that we've been doing over the years. This one in particular was done around 4 years ago with public funding and funding from many multilateral institutions, where actually a mesoscale study was conducted for the case of Mexico, and the resource was studied from the point of view of particular load factors to be able to underpin what is actually the accurate potential and how can these be translated to cost analysis, which was done at the time, and the volume of competitive resources was assessed. And as I said, this was done in a forum led by the Wind Association, but also with the public sector involved. Now, one of the key messages about this graph to take into consideration is that recently, many of us have been seeing technology improvements in relation to wind power in particular, and I'm sure for other technologies it would apply as well. But this curve keeps moving up, no? I mean, in my current company, we're looking at sites where the wind measurement studies from 3 or 4 years ago was saying you'll find a load factor maybe of 32%, but because now there's new machines with larger rotors, you run this study again and you find 37%. So I also wanted to underline that technology continues to evolve very rapidly, and that is a major driver as well for the opportunity. If we go to the next slide, please, and go ahead. This slide represents the volume of activity that has been in terms of assets under operation and currently on development for more renewable and less of clean energies. No? So on the right-hand side, you can see the volume of different sizes. I guess in terms of the amount of assets in development, there can be different conversations. No? And I would just want to remember people where we're coming from, no? In terms of the regulatory framework that applies today, and that it continues to apply as a function of certain rules that were introduced in the law of the electrical sector. So in the past and up until now, and for wind farms and other renewable assets that would be placed in service, that would initiate construction prior to the end of 2016, which means spending out 30% of your investment, you will be eligible for self-consumption rules, which allows you to do energy banking. Also, there's a simplified postage-stamp wheeling cost, and there's a recognition of capacity. Currently in the industry, those assets that are rapidly maturing are planning to get financed as a function of this scheme, but this scheme is experiencing immediate challenges now, in the sense that what's going on is that many off-takers, many of the firms that would sign PPAs, are realizing that these reforms are taking place and that they imply severe or significant new challenges and opportunities, and then they're trying to understand what it means versus signing a long-term contract. So in terms of the announcements that the industry has done of the potential of investment of $14 billion, I think it's important to remember that we need to make those projects bankable. No? They need to be underpinned by a commercial model. And I will evolve a little bit more on this idea because the Secretary of Energy and the Office of Undersecretary Hernández have been very open to this dialogue, and some concepts are rapidly maturing of what this is going to be. And just as a remaining, the IPP model was also present with auctions from CFE. One of the questions that I would like from Secretary Hernández is if we're going to see more of these auctions going forward, no? And when and where might they take place. There was also the model of energy expert, no? Where Sempra built a wind farm on the Mexican side that supplies SDG&E on the Californian side. I think it's the only example that exists. And small producer, which is referred to the compensation by the marginal cost of the node, where there was significant development by PV companies, but due to the severe reduction of the CTCP, which was later corrected last year, I think the bankability of that model came into question, and only one project has come under operation. If we go to the next slide, the next two slides are a summary of the energy reform. I think in general, the goals of this reform were oriented towards driving competitiveness and driving down the cost of power generation and the cost of operation of the system. No? One of the main issues that we have come across in the past is the need to expand and invest into the transmission networks, no? And improve the performance of the distribution business, which have been affecting adversely the results, the financial results of CFE and their performance. The other dimension is this reform is very much oriented, I believe, to take advantage as well of the natural gas opportunity, which it's a very nice complement to renewables in order to be able to serve load with predictability, no? And the deployment of a significant infrastructure of pipelines and turning oil plants into gas-driven plants to reduce cost, because generating power with fuel oil is 3 times more expensive and is materially much more polluting. And in that sense, I know that that's probably the #1 priority in terms of modernizing the system together with renewables. The reform has also allowed us, it's already been explained, for the participation of the private industry, no? And it has changed the mandate of CFE from being a public monopoly to becoming a productive state business, which also generates certain questionings and thoughts that need to be explored further, because now in the Mexican market, and many of us in the private side who are growing in this sector are going to compete against a very significant player that today, at this point, would be the single participant on the supply and demand side of the market. No? And it'll be interesting to understand how that market power is going to be addressed going forward. No? And the role of the SENACE, as it was explained by Undersecretary Hernández, not taking the role of the ISO for the system. Going into the next slide, I think the main point here is the introduction of the clean energy certificates, which were described, I believe, as a renewable portfolio standard. I think to comment upon that, as it's been mentioned, it's not linked to renewables, it's linked to clean energies, and therefore it's very important that the dialogue, the constructive dialogue that has been in place continues in terms of what this means for other technologies and the growth of renewable energy specifically, no? And that is something that is taking place. And I think what is very peculiar about this system, and something that I have not seen in across the other countries where I've operated, is that it doesn't only apply to the utilities, no? It applies to the consumer side as well, no? And on the qualified user side, they're going to have to acquire the certificates, and that seems that it will create a series of new challenges and opportunities, no, for these users, and questioning to what kind of models will be used on that market segment. In relation to the market segment, that it's the utilities, that it's the CFE distribution companies, no. We've been having a conversation where we've expressed that there is, in economic terms, a market failure in power markets when it comes to the bankability of generation assets. No? You don't typically see any appetite from lenders to provide financing to merchant assets. No? Or if there is both quite expensive and at the same time with assets that have their marginal cost base correlated to the market price, which would be fossil fuel generation plants and not renewable plants. And out of that dialogue, there has been very productive conversations in the direction of how to make this scheme bankable, no? And ensure that we're able to achieve the most efficient cost of energy in Mexico for renewables. No? In that sense, going forward, when we look at the goals associated, going to two slides forward, please. What we see is that in the current planning, and before elaborating more on the bankability dimension and what we deem necessary from the private sector, I just wanted to underline once more the size of the challenge that we have ahead of us. When we take the prior plannings that have existed, as an example, on the latest POISE, no, the forecast for 2024 was at 25% of clean energies. That's what you see on the left column. No? Now with the introduction of the 35% goal, what we see is an increased challenge, no? And the goal was already an ambitious one. No? And now in the latest transition law proposal that is being discussed in Congress right now, we understand there's going to be the introduction of a 2018 goal, which is right in front of us, no? That it's likely to have the 25% target, no? Which, knowing that today it's 18%, that means there's going to be a lot to do for all of us, no? And at the same time, we need to make sure we design rules that are conducive to efficient pricing in competitive conditions, no? To elaborate a little bit on this point, if we go to the next slide, right now, as some of you might know, we have a law in place that establishes goals for renewables. It has an acronym that I will not dare to pronounce in English, but it's been the reference point of stating that in Mexico we have goals for renewable energies set into law. These would be goals for clean energies, to be precise. And on the other hand, this law had lacked any teeth in terms of these goals being achieved or being forced to be attained. No? I think one of the biggest achievements of the electricity reform is that the electricity reform itself already has a mechanism for these goals to be defined, and it has a very clear set of penalties if these goals are not achieved. So I think in terms of the criticism that had been in place in terms of Mexico having the right incentives to achieve these goals, we're past that. And this law is going to be likely substituted for a new energy transition law that is going to provide further support to these goals. No? And to close, going into my last slide, if we could go 2 slides forward. No? This image you're seeing on the left-hand side is the result of one of the different studies on policy that were coordinated within the Wind Energy Association in terms of what are the principles we need to be able to achieve the ambitious goals we've set up on ourselves. They're ambitious, but they're attainable, and they have all of us highly energized towards attaining these goals. And in that sense, the first element of this structure is the need for clean energy tenders in terms of providing mechanisms that will give certainty for the value per megawatt hour that we'll be able to attain in order to be able to achieve 2 things. One is be able to raise financing from lenders that is conducive to high capex investments, no? And the other one is be able to achieve a low cost of energy. No? So that is a message that we've been sharing repeatedly. The other dimension is to make sure that the clean energy certificates are in fact bankable, no? Which, as a function of the type of clean energy tenders that are designed, it can very certainly be achieved that way. No? The third message we've been sharing is the need to expand infrastructures, the need for the grid to grow. And in that sense, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the open season mechanisms that have been used in the past, successfully in Oaxaca under a different macro environment and financial environment prior to the crisis that took place in 08 and 09 in financial markets. And now for the growth for the 14 billion investment that was alluded to before, the vast majority of that capacity is located in Oaxaca and Tamaulipas, where these open season mechanisms will need to succeed. And I think we need to make that a top priority and also explore alternative and creative financing mechanisms, or else the expansion of the grid will be the bottleneck, the constraint for all of us to achieve these shared goals. Then we're convinced that it's required that we create a roadmap by technology and by geographic area in order for be able to plan this expansion of this grid. My earlier comment was about how we finance it. The latter comment is about how we plan its expansion. So in the future, we're not in this chicken and the egg problem that we're right now in Oaxaca and Tamaulipas, where the projects cannot mature because they cannot evacuate their power, and the infrastructures are not built because the projects are not mature enough, and therefore it takes in between 3 to 4 years to attain the potential of the area beyond what could have been done if the grid had been expanded beforehand. And then my last message is about how to design policy that is conducive to minimize the cost of renewable power. A message that we've been sharing as well is we need to give visibility to the value chain, of opportunities that hold critical mass and that are visible over the long term. Meaning, if we have a set of goals that the government defines for the private sector that become explicit year over year, maybe we could say every year we want to have 2 gigawatts of new renewable power installed. We will conduct very competitive tenders with maximum prices, and we will do this repeatedly. The result will be that many of us who are active along the value chain will figure out a way to make it happen. We'll figure out a way to be competitive, and the attractiveness of the scale is going to drive all across the value chain a process to think about how to be most efficient. Now, on the other hand, if we don't have that clarity, what's going to happen is that there's some expectation, some players come in, come out. When the opportunities come up, we'll figure out how to hire the best cranes and how to bring in the equipment and how to achieve some financing as opposed to being the most competitive there can be. So I just wanted to underline that message once more. And thank everybody for your time and the attention, and again, the Institute of the Americas and Undersecretary Hernandez. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian, for your insights and perspectives and your roadmaps here at the end. Very interesting in terms of further policy discussions and developments in Mexico. Just a reminder, on your screen there is a bar that says chat, and if you look next to that, there is on the far right side, a little image of a person with a question mark. That's where we'd like you to put your questions. We've received several already. Please put your questions into that area, and then I will begin to pose these questions to our panelists. So with that said, we've received a lot of questions already, and they seem to be breaking into 2 or 3 categories. Lots of questions about cost, power costs going forward, lots of questions about clean energy certificates, and as well as sort of the new market structure, roles, and regulatory and responsibilities of entities involved. Let's take cost first. There was a question at the beginning, if reduced rates is the same as reduction in growth of rates or future rates lower than today. So that was a question of clarification. And then let me put on the screen a very specific question about costs. So Cesar, Undersecretary Hernandez, if you could start by clarifying the question about costs and reduction of costs. And then here we've got the specific question about the anticipated pace of decreases, magnitude, and how they will be perceived by tariff class.
Sure. What we envision basically is a process in which the modernization of the industry reduces the costs of service, and those reductions of costs are transmitted to all the users. If you think about this only from the perspective, you can think about it in terms of the whole system, but if you only thought about it in terms of CFE, which is actually the basic service provider, this is a process that has already begun. And basically what it has meant in very simple terms is that the electricity generation done with fuel oil is being substituted by more efficient, lower cost generation, basically gas-fired combined cycle power plants, and that has been done thanks to the introduction of gas pipelines. That's a very simple example. But the same case can be made with generation through renewables or through clean energy power plants, which are also much cheaper than generation using fuel oil. Since fuel oil constitutes like around 18% of generation currently in Mexico, there is a very wide area of opportunity that can be taken for introduction of new technologies and reduction of costs. How that is translated into reduction of tariffs, the fact is that the federal government retains an ancillary power to set rates for basic service users, and there is users that are not currently participating in the market. And whereas one good example about how that reduction in costs translate into a reduction of rates was early this year, when starting the year a decree was published by the President and the Ministry of Finance, in which a reduction of rates for basic service users, residential users, of 2% was done and justified on the basis that the costs of generation had been lower last year. This is the first time that a reduction of costs is translated into a reduction of tariffs. And that's how it worked in a specific case this year with the application of the new electricity industry law. That does not impinge on the power of the Energy Regulatory Commission to set rates that recover costs for all users. But that does mean that in case of these residential users, whose service is being provided by CFE, the Ministry of Finance can actually establish some regulation that gives them additional benefits when cost reductions are achieved.
Excellent, thank you. There's several questions about clean energy certificates. If we could leave that, I want to ask a couple of specific questions before we get to that. One has to do with some of the changes post-reform between structures. What happens to the self-supply modality under the new law in Mexico? Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sure. The transitory articles of the electricity power industry law basically allow that modality to keep some of people who have the permits for self-consumption, keep their permits and keep the regulatory conditions that were granted to them under those permits by the Energy Regulatory Commission, and also applications that were presented before the entry into force of the new law for getting self-consumption permits are also to be granted, and attached with that, the regulatory conditions that Adrian described are going to be kept for those people. The law establishes that people who want to migrate from the old modality to the new modality, which is basically a generation permit, which establishes the new electricity power industry law, can do so at will. And if they decide that the new modality is not good enough, they can go back once to the old self-consumption permit. The whole objective of that part, that transitory set of provisions of the law, was basically not to introduce a freeze of investments, but rather to let projects that have been matured on the business models which were associated with the self-consumption permits to go ahead and mature. And we think that the new modalities will be better, and the new incentives provided, for instance, by the clean energy certificates will be better. But if people want to go on under the old modalities, they can do so, and that will exist as long as they want. It will be a private decision by private parties whether they keep the old regulation or they move to the next, to the new regulation.
Excellent, thank you. Adrian, let me ask the Undersecretary one more question here, and then we'll see if you want to weigh in as well. There's been a couple of different questions about targets for specific renewable technologies. Here's just one of the questions, but if you could talk about, are there targets for specific renewable technologies? And then this question, besides wind, are there power options for solar in addition?
Well, the options for clean energy certificates and clean energy power are designed to be technologically neutral, so that solar plants will be able to compete with wind farms and geothermal energy, etc., etc., etc. And the important thing about this is that each technology may have a niche in which it is competitive, and some may have even some advantages. For instance, solar plants can be developed much faster than hydro resources, or not to say other types of geothermal plants or whatever other technologies are. So since the auctions are to be conducted 3 years prior to the entry into operation of the plants, solar plants may be competitive in the first auctions, even if their costs may not be as cheap as those of other technologies. But deliberately we have tried to avoid picking winners and choosing specific technologies, because technology is something that evolves very fast and that generates incredible benefits for everyone. And we want to have the biggest impact and let the market and let the private parties decide which projects they develop and which technologies they use and where they locate that. That's the whole objective. Not only because we want to lower costs and tariffs, but also because we believe that efficiency is a very good ingredient in terms of achieving the reduction of gas emissions and other emissions which are harmful to the. If we can do this twice as much with the same amount of money, then we want to be able to do that. And for that, it's good to be technology neutral.
Excellent. Thank you for those clarifications. John, did you want to add anything? I know these have been a lot of policy-specific questions, but before we move to some of the and we'll have to wrap up with a couple of questions on clean energy certificates. I'll give you ask Adrian if you want to weigh in at all on it.
Well, just one comment in relation to these tenders. Designing tenders includes a number of specific questions, no, in terms of how to implement such mechanisms. And as an example, when we talk about being technology neutral, making an apples-to-apples comparison in terms of different generation profiles and different characteristics of intermittency of the like, I'm sure will present for very interesting questions, no, in terms of how to deal with that. Also, to what extent are these auctions at a national level versus different geographical areas versus at a different nodal points, no? The development risk accepted for projects to participate in such auctions. I mean, there's a number of questions that we see resolved in different ways in the markets where these auctions have become common practice, no, and are enabling gigawatts per annum, like Brazil or markets in Central America or South Africa. I mean, there's a lot of experience there. But I also would want to underline that there's a very important trade-off. There's an equilibrium that needs to be found in between what might be a perfectly designed intellectual or academic exercise, no, versus a more practical approach of different things that, when they are applied, might present operational or implementation challenges, no, in terms of many of these questions that I already mentioned that need to be addressed. So I think that trade-off should be something that we're all aware, and we will all aspire to find the most academically well-designed solution, but at the same time we need to test it for practicality and viability in the market. And we're eager to engage in those conversations. These conversations are taking place with the team of Undersecretary Hernández, and I'm sure they'll continue until we launch the first auction, which hopefully will be very soon. I will be interested to hear when will that take place.
Excellent, thank you. We've got to wrap up, but let's wrap up with a few questions on the clean certificates. I've put one specific question on the screen here about the rules and requirements of the clean energy certificate market. When will it be set up? What's the timing? There's some other questions that I want to try and weave in here, if Undersecretary you could respond to. Explain the institutional structure vis-a-vis CRE, SENER, and CFE. And then, if you can, and if we have time, I know everyone's going to wrap up here, talk a little bit about overcoming financial hurdles, which have been issues for these kinds of initiatives in other marketplaces.
Excellent. I'll go with the first question, the one that is in the screen. We published last year the guidelines for clean energy certificates. And those guidelines clarified, as Adrian said before, some of the doubts that had been expressed by industry, for instance, in terms of how cogeneration would be able to qualify, how many certificates it would get for megawatt hour, and things which were very important for everyone and which were expressly solved or I think appended in those guidelines. As I said when I was doing the presentation, we are expecting to publish the first draft of the market rules in a week. So many of the specific rules that will explain how these auctions will take place, what long-term is long-term, and how that combines with the requirements for bankability of projects, will be put there in a draft form, and they will be for public consultation. And they will be there for public consultation until the industry has produced all its comments, and we have had all these very interesting and interactive discussions that we are used to, fortunately. We are very thankful to the industry because, as Adrian said, they provide a reality check for us, and we try to do the things as, well, taking into account best international practices, also top of the line and academic knowledge, but the participation of everyone is good to produce a good result, something which we will feel comfortable with. So in a way, they will have industry and everyone will have 200 pages of regulation in which they will be able to look at all the nooks and different details and have this very interesting discussion. And as what was referred, the requirements, they will be published by the end of March. So by the end of March, the Ministry of Energy will say, this is the percentage, the requirement of all qualified users and the providers of basic service will have to comply with by 2018, and which will be central in determining the size of the auctions and everything which we will conduct. And that's in both cases very soon. So information which will give different private developers what they can base their projects on will be available very soon, and I hope that we will have very interesting conversations and hopefully get consensus on many of the main issues. There was another question I don't recall now.
There was an element, if you could talk a little bit about the structure, in other words, the institutional structure, CRE, SENER, CFE.
Yes, I think it was in one of the slides that I presented first, but basically CRE is the economic regulator. It is an independent regulator, has 7 independent commissioners, which are basically proposed by the President of the Senate and have to be approved by a 2/3 majority at the Senate, which actually means that the party in government cannot decide on its free will who will be there. The commissioners that were before in the CRE were left there. It was not done like in IFETEL or the Competition Authority, where they were all removed and substituted by new commissioners. They were left in place. Only 2 new commissioners were incorporated. Actually 3, because there was 1 vacant position. And the 3 persons that were actually incorporated as commissioners are top professionals. They have no party affiliations. They are seen as reputable persons by the industry. So you have an economic regulator which has new powers given to it by the law, has top people incorporated into the governing board, and has good a budget that was guaranteed to it by law, so it can develop its powers and implement its new powers effectively. On the other hand, you have SENER, which in the transition period is taking a role in not only in policy but also in regulation. As I said, the first market rules will be published by SENER, but the fact that we're doing that in this transitional period and only for one time, just getting the market started, does not mean that we have done it alone. The market rules that we published will be published for public consultation, will have undergone by then a process in which they will have been vetted by the independent system operator, by the people at SENACE, and also by the CRE. And then we can always change our mind when we hear a better proposal by the public. SENEL has this policy role, setting the targets, the requirements for clean energy certificates, publishing the program, but every one of those actions is subject to checks and balances. And you have the ISO, you have the independent system operator, SENACE, which, as I said in the presentation, was created very soon after the laws were published. The transfer of resources from CFE to the ISO was done in time, and we set very stringent and very short times for transfer of personnel, of equipment, of everything, and CFE cooperated. So it's an institutional structure which has a starting point where the Ministry of Energy develops a more active role, and which by the end of this year will be very similar to international standards. The regulator will be doing the regulation, the ISO will be doing the operation of the market and the dispatch of the system, and SENER will only be doing policy from then onwards.
Excellent. No, thank you for that, and we appreciate the flexibility. I'm sure everyone in the industry and the public appreciates the flexibility, but more importantly, we appreciate your willingness and generosity of your time this morning, Undersecretary Hernandez. Thank you so much for sharing these wonderful details, and we look forward to seeing you in person very soon. Adrian Katzew, thank you so much for your perspective and participation and support. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on our webinar, the first of our 2015 Energy Webinar Series. Thank you, Alexis, for keeping everything flowing here so nicely this morning, this afternoon. And please join us in person, whether it's in the Dominican, in Argentina, in Mexico. And we will be shortly getting out the recording and presentations from today's webinar. And we'll also include details on our renewable energy report released late last year. And a final point, we are working with the Undersecretary of Hydrocarbons to do a similar webinar with Dr. Melgar on February 6th. Thank you again. Have a wonderful Friday. We'll be in touch. Thanks for your support.